Good morning. Welcome to the Church of Abiding Presence on the Gettysburg campus of United Lutheran Seminary. I am Shell Huth. I'm the Director of Lifelong Learning and Certificate Studies for United Lutheran Seminary and chiefly responsible for putting this day together. I'm very sad to admit. But you said you needed this, and that's my responsibility to you all, is to be responsive in the things that you need to be equipped to be about ministry in your places and in your spaces. And so with a sad heart, I welcome you here today. I want to be very clear about our time so that there is no confusion. And I've tried to be clear as people have asked questions. This is not a training session for conceal, carry, security stations in your congregational setting. In this chapel, on this campus, we have a no weapons policy, and we uphold that very strongly. This will also not teach you self-defense, because we can't do that in an hour and a half. We recommend that you actually go and take self-defense training classes, if that's something that you're interested in. I've been explaining to folks that this is more along the lines of maybe tornado preparedness. That if your parish congregation setting was in Tornado Alley, you as a congregation would meet and come up with protocols and have a plan in place if a tornado were to come your way. This is not meant to be the penultimate training for you. This will give you some helpful tips and some things to think about in your own places and in your own spaces. But it isn't by no means a guarantee that this will eliminate the possibility of something like this happening in your own space and place. So please don't take this as a blanket safety measure and be complacent because of the training. That's not what we're about today. We're about getting information, equipping you with information that's going to be helpful in your places. And so let us pray. God of hope, in this season of Advent, as we wait and watch, as we hold our breath for the coming of Jesus, who came to earth and for our salvation, suffered death on the cross, and was raised again to new life. These are dark times. Help us to remain hopeful and vigilant in the light of Christ, so that we can help that light shine everywhere we are, because we know that your love through Jesus covers all and brings deep light into the world. Let us take that light out with us today. We give thanks for our presenters. We give thanks for those concerned and caring about those that they are responsible for. Let all of our work continue to give you glory in all of our places, in all of our spaces. And all God's people said. I'm not going to spend lots of time doing introductions because these two very fine gentlemen are going to do that themselves. But I'm so very thankful to have Bill and David from the Public Safety Department at Gettysburg College, who have been going through extensive training because of their positions in an institution that has requirements about safety for their constituency. And so I'm so very thankful that they were willing to partner with me and bring this training to us today. But before they start, if you are on this side and you cannot see the screen, I would suggest you slide over or shift to the other side of the sanctuary so that you can see all of the slides and not miss anything. Bill and David, thank you so very much, and welcome to Church of the Abiding Presence.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Lafferty. I'm going to introduce myself here momentarily. I've never had an initial introduction like that, so that was amazing. I appreciate that. I had always told my mom that one day I would be in front of a church speaking to the congregation. She never believed me. Here I am. So, yes, exactly. In terms of who I am, just a little bit of background, I think it's important for you to know what experience Dave and I bring to the table in terms of this topic. I'm the current assistant vice president of college life at Gettysburg College, and in that role, I'm responsible for overseeing public safety, Greek life, student activities, and experiential education. Prior to that, I worked at Villanova University, where I was the associate director of public safety, and then prior to that, I spent nearly 9 years in the United States Air Force as a security police specialist, and in that role, I developed emergency operations plans and anti-terrorism plans for the United States Air Force. I've been at Gettysburg. Today is my 17th year to this date, where I started at Gettysburg. So Dave and I have been having this conversation on our campus, and we'll talk about this as we walk through the presentation, about what it means to be able to respond effectively and efficiently to an incident of active shooter. We often get questions from our campus community where folks say, well, how do we make sure that this can never happen on our campus? And I don't know that we can actually make a guarantee like that. But we do have some proactive policies and processes that we've put into place over the years, certainly especially following Virginia Tech, that hopefully will reduce the likelihood of an incident like that occurring. And if it did occur, we have established some partnerships with our local emergency responders to make sure that we're able to neutralize the threat as quickly as possible to reduce the likelihood of victimizations. So that's a little bit about me. I've been in this business in law enforcement security for about 30 years and in higher education for 24 plus years. I'm also the director of federal relations for an association called the National Association of Clery Compliance Officers and Professionals. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Clery, but in a campus law enforcement arena, it's the federal legislation which guides a lot of the work that we do. So I'm going to have Dave introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here to talk to you about a serious subject, and hopefully we can all share some information and ideas about the topic. As you can see, I've been there at Gettysburg College since I was 19, I think 33 years now. The last 18 years, I've been the Associate Director, Environmental Health and Safety. My primary responsibilities at the college are fire and life safety, as well as environmental occupational safety. I do a lot of emergency management and response and planning for the campus and designing our emergency operations procedures and then also combining that into our capital projects, because we all know that, although it's an emergency situation, if we need money, we have to plan for that. So we work with our capital people to put in future plans for funding and stuff. So, and also I serve as the campus fire marshal and do arson investigation. I've been in the volunteer fire company since I was a little boy. My father was a volunteer in Bendersville Fire Company. I've served the department 10 years as fire chief and about 15 years as the president, and kind of retired that last year. So taking a little break on that side. But I've also done a lot of work with the National Fire Academy the last few years in teaching life and fire safety on campuses, not just colleges, but all types of campuses. And as I say, I do a lot of occupational safety and health for the OSHA certified authorized instructor. So that's just a little bit about myself, and hopefully we'll talk a little later.
So we're going to talk about a concept called Run, Hide, Fight. This is something that's supported by the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. It's what we use at Gettysburg College in terms of our community outreach and education. We think that from a proactive perspective, it's extremely important that our campus community understand what they need to do in terms of a response should an incident like this occur. Because public safety can't be everywhere. Oftentimes our campus community, our students specifically, will say, well, if there's an active shooter, you're going to tell us what to do. Well, we're going to send you a text message, and you're going to have to make some informed decisions based on the context with which you're presented. So if there's an incident that's occurring on one end of campus, and I tell you to shelter in place, you're going to have to figure out, should I shelter? Should I evacuate based on the information that's presented? What do I need to do? And we always talk to our faculty and our administrators and let them know that you're the stewards of our students. You're going to be giving them instructions, and you need to know exactly how we need to respond. So not unlike a congregation, you want to have some sort of proactive communication and outreach with those who are attending your churches so that they know what they need to do in the likelihood of an unfortunate incident like this occurring. So that's extremely important. The Run, Hide, Fight model, really run is the term for evacuation. Hide, we talk about that in terms of shelter in place. We don't use the term lockdown. A lot of K through 12 institutions do because they have physically one facility where they can very easily lock down and stay within that space. Our campus, we have 85 buildings. We're not going to be able to run around and lock all those buildings down, so we use the term shelter in place so that people know that means I'm supposed to lock my space down. And we'll talk about what that actually looks like. And then fight as a last resort, highly controversial. But if you think about an armed intruder, someone carrying a firearm, entering a confined space, you have to do something, right? That person is there, they're there, they've made a decision to hurt people, and you're going to have to figure out how you're going to defend yourself. So we will talk about the fight concept. I do know, I know it's a sad day when I hear from teachers who are teaching kindergarten kids to go to the corners of the room and grab tennis balls as part of a run, hide, fight scenario. And their fight is that if someone comes into the space with a firearm, hit them with tennis balls. What does it do? It distracts them. It then allows adults and others to intervene. So that's the concept of fight, and we'll talk more about that as we walk through the presentation. The FBI provides some caveats. They will tell you that you're 38% more likely to be struck by lightning than to be involved in an active shooter scenario. So why are we so concerned about active shooter? Well, it's very similar to an airline. Planes don't crash often, but when they do, a lot of souls are lost. An active shooter scenario, a person who is involved in an active shooter incident, their goal is to kill as many people as possible within the shortest amount of time. We will have some videos through this process. We're going to talk about or walk through our concepts of run, hide, fight. Some of the videos are fairly straightforward. They're not gory, but there is gunfire. If you need to walk out, excuse yourself, please feel free to do so. I always like to tell folks that, especially as we present this to students, sometimes it can be a bit emotional. The FBI defines an active shooter as someone actively engaged in killing people. So there is a difference between a shooting incident and an active shooter incident. Oftentimes you hear at college campuses there's an active shooter when in fact there was a homicide. So we're very careful in making that distinction. A shooting incident is just that. Typically isolated, usually some sort of aggressive response. Active shooter, this person has planned, they've prepared, they've established logistics, they know the space that they're going to, and their intent is to kill as many people as possible. So what would you do if we're here, and I know that the seminary uses text messaging alert systems to notify their campus about things that are occurring, typically for weather emergencies. But if you receive a text message here or another space, wherever you're from, that says, active shooter in your library or the library here, run, hide, fight, shelter in place, what would you do?
Where's the library?
Across the street. If we use that, if we use this campus, and we're being told shelter in place, and we're communicating to you that we just received a text message that's telling us to shelter in place because there's an active shooter across the street. So stay, hide, lock down, try to secure the space the best we can, spread out, right? Not all be one big target, there'll be many different targets, and then start having a conversation. What do we do if the person comes through those doors? Who's going to do what? That's what we try to teach our faculty and students. They're going to have to make that decision. Think about Virginia Tech. Cho, who was the killer, entered the academic space, chained the doors, and began shooting easy targets. That's again what this is about, right? They know that they have a very finite period of time to kill as many people as possible because law enforcement will be responding. And most of these folks either kill themselves or allow themselves to be killed. Cho, for example, he shot himself once law enforcement breached the exterior doors and gained access into the building. He had 250 rounds of ammunition still on his person. He was not done. So as he entered that space, he began hitting academic rooms that were easy targets. The doors were open. He began firing. And as other academic spaces heard the shots, they started securing their spaces. As he started walking down the hallway trying to gain access, if a door was locked or barricaded, he did what? He moved. Why? Because he only has a short period of time. He's not going to sit there and try to force his way into a specific space if he can't. Some faculty members use themselves, put themselves against the doors to provide shelter for their students. So we'll talk about why barricading and locking is so important in these types of scenarios. So yeah, we receive a text message, it's across the street. It's probably highly unlikely we're going to safely be able to evacuate, but that's an assessment we're going to make. I'm going to run to the door, I'm going to look, I'm going to listen, I'm going to make a decision. Is that person still in the building? Do I hear shots inside? I may take off. We may have a conversation about that. Or we may say, you know what, too close. Too close for comfort, we're going to stay here, we're going to secure, we're going to wait, we're going to make notification to 911, we're going to update them with information, and we're going to wait for the all clear. So these are decisions that you have to make individually, independently. If you're in charge of a space, if you're in charge of students, if you're in charge of congregation, these are the decisions you're going to be communicating because people are going to be panicking, right? It's going to be challenging for them to make these types of independent decisions. Think about Las Vegas. We'll talk about that here momentarily. Outside venue now. You know, we've always been talking about active shooter, inside spaces. How do we shelter in place? How do you shelter in place in an outside venue when somebody's shooting from 30-some floors out of a hotel window? So situational awareness is extremely important. When you go into a venue, you know, always think about a space like that. I used to have friends when I was younger who always wanted to go up to the stage at a concert. And I'm the furthest away from the stage I can be. Why? Because I don't want to be trampled. I don't want to be caught. I want to see where the exits are. I want to pay attention to that. When I go into a restaurant, my wife always, she freaks out about this. One, I have to always face the door. Two, as I walk into the restaurant, the first thing I do is I go to the restroom because I want to see what closets and other spaces and kitchen, where the kitchen area is, in the event that I need to shelter within that space. Someone comes through that front door, I'm not going to be able to fight right off the bat, most probably. I'm going out the back. So I want to know how to do that. Situational awareness, paying attention to your surroundings. Well, the Ohio State incident, I use this because, you know, again, near to home when I talk about Gettysburg College and our students, but they did an excellent job in their preparation around this concept of run, hide, fight. And I'll show you some pictures of that. Assailant used a car and a butcher knife as a weapon. You remember he ran over some folks and then started stabbing them, and then Ohio State law enforcement officer shot him dead. FBI investigated links to terrorism. Shelter in place was ordered. This is the exact message through their Buckeye Alert: active shooter on campus, run, hide, fight. Watts Hall, 19th and College. So they're telling you exactly where the incident is occurring, and they're telling you to make a decision based on the information that you're being presented. Obviously, employee quotes, there was mass chaos. We barricaded ourselves like we're supposed to. So I use this as an example because they did an excellent job based on their preparation and planning. This is what barricading looks like. So you're not just going to lock the door, you also want to barricade it the best you can. Again, you're creating a delay. If a shooter wants to access that space, they're most likely going to move on because they're not going to be able to untangle that. Our current environment, we are in a beautiful area of Pennsylvania, but it's not free from crime. The local community has their fair share of issues. And I think it's hard to tell when I think about my work as an educator within a college environment, when we have students coming from New York or other large metropolitan areas and they're coming to Gettysburg, they're like, what happens in Gettysburg? And I have to continually remind them that there are issues that are occurring here locally. There is a steady climb of crime that is occurring 2 to 3 blocks from our main campus. I want to make them aware of that. I want to make them aware that there's an increase in opioid use within Adams County, which is the county that we're sitting in right now. That there are a lot of issues that are occurring. There are mental health issues locally and on college campuses. Mental health issues continue to climb, specifically on college campuses nationally. When we think about that current environment around mental health, students, I'll use that as an example, are using our counseling services to the highest rate we've ever seen before in the history of our counseling center. Our counselors are dealing with the seriously ill. So what does that mean about the worried well? What do I mean by that? Well, the worried well used to be the student who had some anxiety as a result of their transition into college, right? They're leaving home for the first time, they're going to college, there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. Will they fit in? What does that mean? Who do I talk to? Counselors 15 years ago used to have those conversations with those students. There may be some anxiety right around finals time, right? Students all of a sudden realize, wow, you know what? I didn't study all semester. Now I've got a test. Now I'm anxious. What am I going to do? If I fail the test, mom and dad are going to be extremely upset. They're the worried well folks that administrators and faculty now have to deal with because counseling is inundated with the seriously ill. What do I mean by seriously ill? Folks with major anxiety and mood disorders. Their anxiety levels are so high, we've had some students who couldn't leave their room at a specific point in time. Thought disorders, substance abuse. Think about folks within congregations, right? Think about pastoral counseling and the conversations that you're having. I'm sure those conversations have changed over a period of time, I would bet. So these issues are continually increasing, both within a campus setting and without. So when is it time to get someone to counseling? When you're having conversations with folks and you see that there's impaired functioning, right? Signs of significant depression, aggression, victimization, certainly suicide ideation. Another issue that's on the incline on college campuses is suicide ideation. Homicidal risk. So I had said earlier, I'm often asked by faculty members and administrators, how do we prevent this from happening on campus? Well, we want to be proactive, right? We want to reduce the likelihood. I cannot eliminate the possibility. This could happen at any moment, as we know, right? We've seen it on television. We've seen how quickly it occurs, and we'll talk about that process as we move through the presentation. But preparedness is extremely important. Threat assessment. When I think about threat assessment, I'm thinking about assessing our processes for identifying people in need. Who are our students in need? Who are our congregation friends who are in need? Who has said what to who? How do I provide appropriate intervention? How do I get them connected to counseling if, in fact, they need it? The FBI will tell you that in all of these cases, these active shooter cases, when they rewind the incident and they go through their investigative process, there was always leakage. What do I mean by leakage? These folks were telling other people either they were going to directly do it, or they wrote a paper that was concerning, or they had conversations with friends, or as you see, as they move through the process, now they're using social media to communicate, they're developing their own manifestos. They may tell a friend as they've made a decision to go to a school, for example, and engage in an active shooting incident. They may say, you know what, don't go to school tomorrow. So there is leakage. It bubbles up. There's a period of time. These folks don't wake up and say, today is a good day for me to commit mass homicide. It doesn't work that way. So threat assessment is important. Physical security, thinking about your space. Right? Some of these are old buildings. I think about Gettysburg College. I think about the seminary. They weren't designed with this in mind. So when you think about retrofitting existing spaces, what does that look like? Access and control, locks, closed circuit television cameras. When you think about new space, you're thinking about crime prevention through environmental design. How do I make sure a new space, new construction, or significant renovation is designed in a way that reduces the likelihood of this type of incident from occurring in a space? Have many of you been thinking about physical security within your spaces? If not, I hope you do. We have begun, years ago, we were taking locks off of classrooms to allow easy accessibility for students to gain access to those classrooms 24 hours a day. Now we're putting locks back on the classrooms because we have spaces that don't lock, large spaces that don't lock, which in this type of a scenario is concerning. Enhance education, certification, and awareness. So again, educating your community, having a conversation like we're having today about this particular topic. Thinking about who within your environments needs to be specifically certified to do the training and to respond to this type of a scenario. So I know that some churches are hiring security folks, or members of their congregation participate as a security team, right? You may have law enforcement, former law enforcement, military associated with your congregation. You want to reach out to those folks. They have a certain level of expertise, and have them help you develop a response plan. And in planning, preparation, and application. If this is the first time you've talked about this, that's okay, but do something about it moving forward. Continue the conversation, because you need partners in this. It does take a village in order to respond, right? You're just not talking about your own specific isolated island. So what are the promising practices? Proactive community outreach. I can't stress that enough. I've talked about it already. I'm going to continue to talk about it. Education and communication. Developing a response plan and communication with local and state authorities. How many of you reached out to your local law enforcement? Extremely important, right? They're the ones coming. We at Gettysburg, we have a state police, local law enforcement. I'm talking local law enforcement. I'm talking multi-jurisdictional local law enforcement on our campus every summer talking about this issue. One, I want them on our campus so they're familiar. I want them in our buildings. I want them going through their response plans. I want my staff to actually be able to see that. Again, I'm trying to reduce the likelihood of this happening, and if it happens, I want to be able to neutralize the threat as quickly as possible. So local law enforcement has all of our building plans on a thumb drive, so they can easily access the space if they need to. Partnership. Don't have them come out just once. The first time to meet your local law enforcement is not during an emergency scenario. So that is extremely important. Practice the plans. Do some type of preparation, whether that's with local law enforcement, whether that's with your own campuses, your congregations. Have a conversation. Have people think about it. Now when we send out a text message, every semester we send out a text. We say, this is a test, practice shelter in place. I want them to hear that terminology all the time, and I want them to think about it, because I'm not telling them to go do it, but when they see that text, they're going to think about, all right, I'm in this space right now. I know what Bill told me about shelter in place. How would I do that? That's important. Provide specialized training to the administrators and staff, so those folks who are responsible for supervising the spaces that you're in, they should know what to do because people are going to look to you to tell them, to help instruct them, to guide them. Incorporate this concept of crime prevention through environmental design into your spaces. Whether you're retrofitting, building new spaces, think about that and how you can incorporate security into the renovation process. Develop redundancy in emergency mass notification if you use those types of systems. Don't just use text, have redundancy. So when I think about what we do at Gettysburg as an example, we have a siren, we have a text messaging alert, we have computer pop-ups, we send blast emails. There's a host of ways we want to push information out. We have a public address system within some of our buildings to notify people of an emergency occurring on campus. Create multidisciplinary threat assessment teams. So this became popular after Virginia Tech. And I had talked about just a moment ago about this concept of leakage. Prior to Virginia Tech, the campus, large school, right, 40-some thousand students, key administrators didn't come together to talk about concerns they had with specific students. So had they might have recognized in an isolated incident, Cho was sent off campus for some mental health issues and was not allowed to come back to campus until he was cleared from a counselor. He ultimately was cleared from an off-campus counselor and come back on campus. There were some domestic violence issues connected with Cho. There was some disturbing writing associated with him and within his classroom. So had folks got together on a regular basis, maybe they would have started having a conversation about this particular student. Maybe there would have been some intervention provided. It doesn't mean this incident would not have happened. I think Virginia Tech did a remarkable job, both in preparation and planning and their response, even though they were heavily criticized. But when I think about these behavioral threat assessment teams, specifically on college campuses, but certainly you could have, I assume, one operate on a smaller scale within a church, I think about people who are in need and everyone having bits and pieces of information. So when we're having a conversation about a student, our academic advisor may say, yep, faculty are having some concerns about Janie. She's a straight A student. She's now getting C's. Yeah, within the residence hall we heard about Janie. She's been quite disruptive. She's begun drinking. She's never drank before. These are pieces of information that in and of themselves may not mean much, but together could mean that Janie needs some intervention and assistance. So behavioral threat assessment is extremely important. Establishing clear reporting protocols, including anonymous reporting. So if someone is concerned about someone else, who do they tell? And have you made that clear? And are you communicating that? Again, you're not telling them to narc on people, right? But if they see something, say something. And really talk about it from a care perspective. We care about each other. We want to know if someone is seeing Joe who's extremely upset because I may want to provide some intervention for Joe. That's the manner in which you would want to communicate it, about caring for each other. Establishing clear, we already talked about that. Conducting physical security assessments, thinking about your space. How does it lock? Where does it lock? What are some rooms that I can use for shelter in place? How do I evacuate everybody from a building? Do you do evacuation drills? What do they look like? When you do an evacuation drill, does everybody evacuate in the same manner every single time? There was a K through 12 shooting, I believe in Arkansas years ago. 2 students, most of your shooters are single shooters. In this case, there were 2 shooters, very rare, high school students. One was on a hill with a rifle and the other one went in and pulled the fire alarm. And they knew that everybody was going to evacuate out the front doors. And that's when they began shooting. So thinking about those processes, having those types of conversations, we often think about that because, in terms of emergency responders now, emergency responders have been injured through pipe bombs and some other devices that have been placed at buildings, knowing that they were going to respond to certain areas. So post-Virginia Tech, I think this is where most institutions of higher education woke up and said, you know what, we need to think about this very differently. The state of Virginia did an assessment and provided threat assessment protocols for all the schools within Virginia. And we used that, Gettysburg used that as a model in terms of our assessment. And we did a campus-wide assessment and started looking at our different buildings and saying, again, not how we eliminate it, but how do we reduce the likelihood of this type of a scenario from happening. Many physical security upgrades through lighting, access control, closed-circuit television cameras. I talked about the behavioral threat assessment team, making sure we had the right people around the table so that as information bubbled up, we were able to make sure that that person of concern got connected to resources, emergency response protocols, making sure we have processes for responding to an incident of violence, whether that's armed intruder or some other incident of violence. Do you have policies and procedures? What do they look like? Who do they involve? Who are you going to call? Agreements with local law enforcement. Again, you don't want to meet local law enforcement for the first time during an emergency. You want to have preparation and planning. You want to establish and train whoever your emergency response team is. You can have an emergency response team on a small scale. Think about a congregation, having conversations. I know some churches, I'm talking to colleagues who are connected with churches and are saying, yeah, our church is having this conversation. We have a security detail team. We have an emergency response team. We're talking very differently about this, and education and community and practice. So crisis management, what do we do in the event of a significant incident? There are really three things that are extremely important and where our focus needs to be. And when you think about emergency operations and planning and response protocols, you kind of want to craft your processes around these three issues. Containing the incident, right? Active shooter is over at the library. How do we work to contain that? We make sure that we get everybody inside, sheltered in place, notify law enforcement, get law enforcement to the threat. Notification, not just to law enforcement, but to our campus communities, our buildings, communication. How do we notify folks that something terrible is happening so that we can minimize casualties? That's really what it's about, right? If we can prevent it, great. We want to do everything we can to reduce the likelihood, but if it happens, how do we reduce the number of victimizations? How do we make sure we're notifying folks that this is occurring so that they can take care of themselves? There are different types of violence, and I always think this is important to talk about. There's violent behavior where someone is extremely upset at someone else and they swing and they take a punch. It's isolated. There's a response, right? There's an action and a reaction. Then there's examples of targeted violence. That's what we're talking about. These are the folks that are involved in active shooter incidents, assassinations, stalking cases. They're surveilling, they're observing, they're going through a process. They're very focused on what they're doing. So what does the FBI tell us? They tell us that the average duration of an active shooter incident is 12 and a half minutes, and the average law enforcement response is 18 minutes. What's that tell you? These folks are done, right? In most cases, before law enforcement gets there. Sometimes they continue because they want to be killed by law enforcement. Active shooter incidents can occur anywhere, as we know now. Not just in higher ed, not just within the corporate world, but even in our churches. Think about the post office years ago. Remember the term going postal? Have you heard that term recently? Post office has done a remarkable job in threat assessment. They have taken the bull by the horns and said, we've got to do something because this is a plague within our system. So they've developed policies and protocols around recruitment, retention, intervention, counseling, response. You haven't heard much of that from the post office. So they are a model that's out there. The military. Military has and continues to have its issues, but not as significant as you would see in the non-military world because they have clear response protocols and intervention systems in place. There's a need to pre-plan and train for your response. We talked about that. I can't talk about that much. I don't know how well you can see that, but this is a pie chart to just break down where these shootings are occurring. You can see 24% occurred in educational environments. That includes K through 12 and institutions of higher education. Most of these are still occurring in the corporate world. so workplace violence scenarios. Active shooter incidents, this was the first data collection from the FBI, 13-year period, 2000 to 2013. 64 shooters ultimately committed suicide, 37 before the police arrived. 97% of the shooters have been male. That doesn't mean ignore the fact that it could be a woman or someone else, but 97% have been male. And again, as I said, the majority are single shooters. Oftentimes when the incident occurs and the chaos unfolds, law enforcement is responding and they hear multiple shooters. And they hear multiple shooters because what people are reporting is civilians who are carrying firearms or might be responding to the incident, undercover law enforcement who are responding to the incident, but in most cases it's isolated, not in all cases. Age of shooters, there's a wide range. It really depends on the environment, right? If it's K through 12, you're down towards the 16-year-old age. If it's within the corporate environment, you're closer to 50. Why? Layoffs, people who feel they've been unfairly fired or terminated, right? Significant loss. People are experiencing significant loss. And how we experience loss or how we define significant loss is individual. That's why, think about, again, the post office. One of the things that they did is they stopped firing people on Friday afternoon. They thought very differently about that. Or leading up to the Christmas holidays. Not a good time to be having that kind of a conversation. So wide age range depending upon where the incident is occurring. Virginia Tech continues to be the highest casualty rate on an institution of higher education. 32 souls perished, or 32 perished, and there were 17 additional casualties. So an update from the FBI. We go from 2013 to 14 and 15, 40 incidents in 26 states. That's a pretty significant increase. Again, still more likely to what? Be struck by lightning, but these incidents, without a doubt, are increasing. 42 shooters, 39 male, 3 female, 2 husband and wife teams. 16 shooters committed suicide, 14 shooters were killed by law enforcement. You can see the theme. The FBI studies this, they have the data, they're pushing this information out so that we can prepare ourselves. And then within 2016, 20 incidents in 2016 alone. All involved lone male shooters, the average age was 30. 3 incidents occur within K through 12 environment. 8 incidents in open spaces. So now again, like I said, we're seeing this at festivals, we're seeing this at concerts. So what happened at Las Vegas? Here you can see the timeline, fairly aggressive, right? You think about, and again, you have a large-scale event, law enforcement is already on site, so you have available resources there. 10:05, first shots are fired. 10:12, first 2 officers arrive on the 31st floor. Remember, the shooter was on the 32nd floor. 10:15, the last shots are heard. That's quick. He killed himself. He had barricaded himself into the hotel room. It took law enforcement 75 minutes to get into that hotel room. He had barricaded himself so successfully. And he had planned this before. So as they started to unwind, he was at some other festival in a hotel, similar setup, either practicing or was going to do it and backed off. But he had been thinking about this for some time. More than 58 folks died, 500 injured. So facts about targeted violence. These are the folks that are planning. They're considering, planning, and preparing before they engage in violent behavior. Most discuss their plans with someone. There's leakage of some sort, whether it's verbal, whether it's writings, whether it's drawings. Most have concerned others with troubling behavior. Joe has really changed. Joe is really drinking quite heavily. Joe just lost his mom and dad in a tragic car accident, significant loss, and as a result of that, he's never really recovered. I'm not quite sure what's wrong with Joe. They're showing signs of significant problem and requiring some sort of intervention. Most are suicidal or at a point of desperation prior to their attacks. That doesn't mean everyone who expresses suicide ideation is going to become homicidal, but those who do in these scenarios, clearly we saw, right? They either kill themselves or they wait for the police to come and kill them. 5 stages of an active shooter. I'd said they don't wake up one day and say, today is the day I'm going to commit homicide. They wake up, they have some sort of an issue, something happened, some sort of an injustice that they began collecting, and it could be several injustices over a period of time. Then they reach the point where they start fantasizing in terms of response. So they were tragically and inappropriately terminated in their mind, right? They go home, they stew about that, they think about it, they say, you know what? This really has me angered. What happened at Las Vegas, I could do that. I think I could do that. I think when I want to do it, I'm going to think about the right time. Virginia Tech happened right around when Columbine did. A lot of things happen in April. Anybody have an idea why? Hitler's birthday. People connect to Hitler's birthday as an anniversary. So they're fantasizing, they're dreaming. Then they begin planning. They're determining logistics. The who, what, when, where, how, right? Up to this stage, you still have the ability to provide some sort of an intervention and respond. When they get into the preparation stage, they're serious. They're obtaining resources, they're conducting walkthroughs, they're sitting in your congregation, and they're watching, maybe for weeks. What is the timing of the congregation? When do most people get into the space? What does it typically look like? When they reach the approach stage, you're not going to turn them around unless law enforcement engages them at that point. Their plans are finalized, they're committed to the act, and they're going to go implement their act. Situational crime prevention. I talked a little bit about this in terms of how I sit in a restaurant and the things that I'm thinking about in terms of being able to evacuate, where are the nearest exits, how would I shelter in place. If you think about this church, and I think about situational crime prevention, I'm thinking about how do I harden this target? Is this a potential target? Yes. How do I harden it? What do I think about? I'm thinking about physical security. I'm thinking about personnel security. I'm thinking about a whole host of things. Some of those may not be realistic, but I put them on the table, right? Throw it against the wall, see what sticks, let's work through it. What's best for this particular situation or environment? Increasing the perceived difficulty of the crime, right? If someone is walking up to this building and, for example, they see armed security officers out front, they're probably going to turn around and walk away if you make that target difficult or challenging. Increasing the risk that they're going to be caught or exposed before they actually attempt the shootings. Reducing their rewards. Again, they've been fantasizing about this. They have their plan in place. They're going to have more casualties than ever before. Their name is going to be remembered. You're reducing that reward. That potentially could have an impact on reducing the likelihood that that person is going to carry out their attack. This is a good place to pause for questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk through the run, hide, fight, show a couple of videos of what that looks like so that you have an understanding of what we mean by shelter in place and evacuation, etc. Yes, sir.
I'm going to bring a microphone around so folks can hear your questions.
Have you worked with any churches in actually developing active run, hide, fight plans?
I have not personally, but a colleague who is my associate director has. So he and I have,
Hopefully they've never had to use it, but if they have, how effective was it?
it sounds, so they actually hired, through their congregation, former law enforcement folks to carry within the building. And they've done some drills, and they've developed some preparation and planning, and they reached out to local law enforcement and said, hey, here's our space, here's what it looks like. So law enforcement can look at the points of entry, how do they enter, what are they expecting once they get inside the space.
Hard to gain acceptance of this kind of programming in the congregations?
Not in this particular scenario, but I imagine it probably is.
Bill started us off by reminding us to build a relationship with our local law enforcement agencies so that they can see your spaces and help you think about what do those individual spaces look like. And so having that institutional understanding is helpful for each of us in your own spaces and places because there are unique things to every single building.
And even in our environment, so Dave and I will do these types of presentations with our faculty and staff, and oftentimes they'll reach back out and say, can you come look at my individual workspace and talk about ideas that we might employ in order to reduce the likelihood of us becoming victimized? Because we're talking about the campus on a large scale. They want to bring it down to their space.
Yeah. What I hear you saying, amongst other things, is it's in some cases as simple as putting deadbolts on these big open doors that we've got in church that are so nice and secure, so that people on the inside of the space can lock up.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not, it's thinking about every single aspect of your space because many of us, even at institutions, don't have a lot of dollars to dump into it to make this space hardened, right? There's a lot of great technology that's out there right now and a lot of folks that are selling, specifically colleges, a whole host of stuff. But it really gets down to, can I lock this door? And if I can, what does that look like? And now I have the ability to very quickly shelter in this particular space successfully.
So I'm curious of what the active shooter plan is for this building for us today. We're sitting here, unlike most other churches, we're all facing front. An active shooter could come in the back, and this is a gun-free zone, so they know nobody's armed. So what would a plan be for a building like this?
Well, I'm leaving as quickly as I can. That's a great question, right? I would have to turn it over to our host to see if they had a conversation about that.
We have not had specific conversations, but the faculty and staff about 2 years ago or so went through this same training protocol and made ourselves aware of the buildings and what is available on the buildings. And so in this space specifically, if we found that an active shooter was coming into this space, there are some options. And so one option is to shelter in place into this chapel, which has wood doors that you can block it off. There is, on this side of the building, there is a stairwell that goes downstairs and is a rear exit. And so it's at a different level and a rear exit out of the back of this building. And so it's even changed the level, the elevation, so that you can exit this building and head down the hill so that you're at a completely different elevation. So that's an option. But there's also a choir room, which then inside the choir room is a basically sealed mechanical room, which then has beyond it a catacomb. And so there's multiple spaces down there for sheltering in place. And so being aware of what are the places for us to shelter in place? And even simplistic things, like we have these risers on the floor up here. They're movable risers. You'd get a couple of people, pick up the riser, barricade the door from the inside.
You know, I would say, so even something that straightforward, which I think is great, that's a lot of thought. When you think about exits, when we see administrative buildings, when we look at the exits, oftentimes they're blocked with ladders and boxes and some other stuff, so it's a moot point. You're going to get people trapped specifically in there. So to your point, it might be as simple as a lock, it might be as simple as clearing some hallways, it might be as simple as every time before you start church, you have a conversation. If we need to evacuate today, here are the number of spaces, not unlike the airlines, right? Buckle up and here are the exits. Because everybody's going to do what? Think about the way they came in terms of an evacuation, and that may not be possible.
So I recently visited an event at a church that was a secure facility. It had locks, it had cameras, it had security personnel stationed throughout the church. And a lot of the people visiting found that incredibly off-putting. And it made them feel they were not in a space of worship, they were not in a space of welcome. In a lot of our congregations in this area, we have people that could be tremendously triggered because of, previous drills, 3 Mile Island, these kind of things. And then we also have individuals who aren't familiar with this type of vocabulary. They might not have been in school districts, that kind of thing. What is some language that has been successful bringing this conversation into a space for the first time? How can we talk to our congregations without completely freaking out, stressing, triggering, or causing them to shut down to the point where, people don't have to come to our spaces. They have to go to school, even if they don't like what's happening there. If someone is traumatized enough or has a negative enough experience at church, they don't have to return. So how can we as churches have this conversation in a way that specifically keeps it non-frightening and welcoming while not losing this information?
Right. That's a great point. So today we're talking very different language because I hope everybody knew what they were walking into in terms of the conversation. But we often use, so when we reached out to faculty about self-care, we talk about emergency response. And we talk about everything from natural emergencies to these types of scenarios. So that we say, look, we want to be the best prepared that we can be. We don't really talk about active shooter. We don't necessarily say that out loud unless that's the meaning of that particular presentation. So I would encourage you to talk more broadly about care for everyone and how we're going to respond to an emergency. And should we shelter in place in here for a tornado, this is what it might look like. These are the conversations you might want to have. I truly understand where you're coming from. This one up.
For the gun-free zone, is it possible that you would be able to use pepper spray? And the reason why I say that is because a friend of mine retired 30 years ago from the government, and he had a little keychain, pepper spray, and he wanted to try it out and see if it still worked. He did it in his basement. He went outside, and when he came back, he couldn't even go in the basement anymore.
Right.
And I was wondering if that might be if you confront somebody, this stuff is really, it can be nasty.
Right.
And it can really set somebody back.
Everybody hear the question? Can pepper spray be useful? It can. You got to be in close contact, right? You want to be careful about using it indoors because everybody's going to get it, depending upon where you spray it. But if you're thinking about the fight mode, which we're going to talk about, where it's the last resort and you're face-to-face, certainly. I mean, we talk to faculty about using a fire extinguisher as a fighting mechanism. Shooting it in someone's face will work quite well, actually. So we do have those conversations. It depends on the context and I wouldn't use that as a first response. I wouldn't just go shooting it, especially in a confined space. All right, for time's sake, I'm going to turn it over to Dave, and then we, clearly have a Q&A period at the end, and we'll be willing to stay here as long as you all would like us.
All right, we're going to talk more direct on hide, run, fight, and the choices and decision-making of when do we hide versus when do we run, and when at last chance do we fight. So we're going to talk a lot about that. And, the old terminology years ago first came out was lockdown. And the big question, depending on the size of a facility, is how do you lock down 80, 90 buildings, or a facility like the seminary? How do you lock buildings that are traditionally open and open safe spaces? Most buildings across the country are not locked down high security. But today, that has changed, correct? High schools and elementary schools are already locked down. They're secured. So that doesn't mean that those folks are safe. All right, Bill talked about intruders plan. They study. They know about the place that they're going. It's not the first time they've walked into that facility. The student at Virginia Tech, he knew that classroom, and he knew that academic building. He chose that building for a reason. He had good working knowledge of the facility. So he knew the layout. He knew what to bring, bolt cutters and chains to lock the doors. He had a plan. So the best security you may have, they were going to find a way. Where there's a will, there's a way. So the basic lockdown philosophy doesn't necessarily work in this aspect. So over the course of time, Run, Hide, Fight has come out and it's been pretty effective. And you know, when these attacks happen, the FBI, they study these and they see how people survived and what worked and what didn't work. And they came down to, you know, Run, Hide, Fight seemed to be the thing that people can remember quickly during an emergency, and really the training program. When we talk about fire safety, we're taught at really early age about stop, drop, and roll, smoke, crawl, those things. How about active shooter? Have you had any training through school? It doesn't exist, right? We didn't have this problem for society. So we're really behind the 8 ball in educating our communities and our people what to do in these situations. So hide. Another word is a shelter in place. A place that you can secure yourself relatively quickly. You know, and every day you want to be able to notify 911 if possible, if you have a cell phone. But at the same time, when you do lock down, you don't want the cell phone to be ringing when you're hiding under a desk or something like that and give your position away. Obviously, turning out lights, closing the blinds and your windows, you lock your door, barricade your door, whatever you can do to secure yourself in there. Obviously, you want to remain quiet. And then, as we talked about, and what we're going to talk about is, if the decision right now is to hide, because we've heard gunshots right outside the hall or right outside the door, that may not be the best 2 minutes from now. It may be, let's evacuate, let's run. And we have a window of opportunity because we've seen the shooter go in a different direction. So these things are fluid. Your decision making will change as the situation changes. So barricading and using what you have, and you know, some great illustrations. This room would be very different. You know, 6, 7, 8. You know, there's multiple ways in and out of this building. So to be able to barricade this is going to take a little bit of work. But we have a lot of people, and we could probably do it fairly good if we broke up into teams and secured it. But we may seek something different at a lower level, and it's easier to access. So again, using what you have, tables, barricade, the chairs, whatever you may have at the point to try to lock and secure those doors. So here the picture's a little hard to see, but holding doors using a belt, electrical cord, and wrapping around the doorknob, and then just using your weight to hold against it. So when the intruder comes to open the door, there's resistance there. And hopefully the idea is they're going to go down the hall to another location. They're going to bypass because they don't have the time. 12 minutes is not a lot of time in reality, and you know, whatever you can do to try to keep that secured for them to come in is important. Here's some pictures. Doors that have closures on, self-closing doors, do have some advantages to trying to keep them secured by putting a belt across that closure. And the top picture is really rough to see, but I think they're using a tie, so just a necktie.
This is important because this is Ohio State. This is just another example of their training. This is a faculty member and student sheltering in place based on a text message from that vehicle had driven over people. You recall that scenario as we started the session today.
So it's really important for you to evaluate your spaces. If it's a workspace, or a space of assembly, you know, have some kind of things ahead of time put in place or thought about. It really helps. But these things can be improvised pretty quickly. So here's a video.
This is showing how you can use a chair or a stool on a door that opens outward that uses a handicap accessible type lever. Just take the chair, put it between the handle and the door frame. You want to make sure enough of the chair extends over the door frame so that when someone pulls on the door, it forms a barrier. Obviously with the vision panels, this isn't a permanent solution, but it's better than an unlocked door.
Again, very helpful if you work on that beforehand, if you have a chance. Some things will work, some will not, chairs. We found when we were talking to our faculty and we've offered, you know, them to come over to their space to look at their space. Sometimes that chair in the door doesn't work, depending on the doorknob and stuff. So you really have to look at it first ahead of time. But in the real situation, you do what you can quickly. So now we're talking about evacuate. When do we evacuate? How do we do it? You know, we may have decided to hide first initially, and then information has come to us to say, okay, we have a window of opportunity here. We see police right outside the door. We can evacuate to a safe space or a safer space. And we decide that we're going to run and we're going to get out. Hopefully, you know, it might be a window. We've had people when we've been teaching this, they've already come and said they've already checked their office out. They can come out their ground floor window from their office, and then they can go to their car and secure themselves in their car. It's great to have that type of plan. Obviously, if there are shooting, you want to run in a zigzag motion to try to not be the target. Harder to hit a moving target. And then always try to notify 911, let them know what's going on. Even though 911 centers are inundated with people calling in, they're getting pieces of information that you may share, descriptions or gunfire at a certain level, and they're filtering that information to police responders as it goes, because these things in 12 minutes can be very fluid. Is there more than one shooter? Is there two? What are they wearing and stuff like that. That information is really important for emergency responders, so we do encourage, if you can, to notify them.
Just a comment there, Dave. So when you think about evacuation, what's the first thing people do when they hear a sound? They just hear a sound. They don't know if it's gunfire or what. What do? They don't run, right? The Las Vegas folks, they froze. They stopped, they stood, they stared, they looked, they waited. There was no initial evacuation, right? People are trying to recognize. Gunshots, for those who are not familiar, sound very different depending upon where they're being fired and where you're at in relation to the shot. I can't tell you how many times our trash truck, when it backfires on the backside of our athletics facility, if I'm on the other side, to me it sounds just like a gunshot. And the first reaction I have is to move and evaluate and assess it. I don't want to move in a manner that frightens people, but I don't want to just stop and stare and think, did I hear what I hear? So the new day is telling people, if you hear something, pay really close attention to it and react or respond in some sort of a way. Don't make an assumption anymore that, oh, well, it's just a trash truck. A few years ago, we had on campus what I refer to as a newspaper shooting. So let me explain. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and Dave calls me and says, we've just had a reported shooting. So of course, you know how I'm responding. Saturday morning, 5 o'clock. We're text messaging, we're shelter in place, we're setting the siren off. Police are responding and investigating. We don't have an active incident, but we're not sure because we can't find the shooter. Come to find out, it was a newspaper delivery person, 5 o'clock in the morning, driving down the wrong side of the street so that they could throw the papers out the driver's side window. Students who don't know what newspapers are anymore, was walking down the street. This newspaper was wrapped. It was early morning. It was a little wet outside. It hit the sidewalk, and it sounded like a gunshot. All the student saw was the hand coming out the window and some silvery flash and a boom. And we ended up in lockdown. So, I mean, you know, recognizing and responding is just an example of how things can sound very different to different people at different times of the day. Gettysburg, when the sun goes down and it's late at night, I hear everything. So it's just, you know, in terms of situational awareness, something to pay attention to.
So it's the ultimate last option is then to fight. So if we are hiding and sheltering in place here in this room, and there is an intruder, a gunman coming in the door, we need to come up with a plan. Now we have 50, 60 people here. We can come up with a plan on what we can use for improvised weapons. We've a whole bunch of these, right? So somebody comes in the door and there's a whole bunch of these being lobbed. All right, what's that going to do? It's a distraction, right? Hopefully they're going to be dropping their guard, dodging books, while we then maybe be able to get somebody to come around the back and take, take him down. Anything. They're talking in elementary schools and kindergarten where they put tennis balls in the corners of classrooms. So in case of a situation, the kids can throw the tennis balls at the shooter, and hopefully the teacher, it'll be enough distraction that the teacher might be able to get an upper hand on the shooter. Again, working together and using who we have and what we at our hands. Bill talked about fire extinguishers, a great weapon also to shoot when it's empty. It can be thrown, and they're readily available. We've got chairs all through here in the sanctuary to be able to use. So maybe it's a couple books, and then we start with chairs, and that's certainly going to put the. Do you think the intruder coming in is going to expect a fight? No, that's not what they're expecting. What are they expecting? Yeah, they're going to expect you to either be hiding or not fighting back.
Now, the fight piece is great if you already know something's happening somewhere, right? You're sheltering in place, you're securing, and then you're having this conversation. So you're pulling these things together so they can be used at the different entrances or exits to the space if the person decides to break through. If it just happens spontaneously, someone stands up in the back right now and they're the active shooter, we need to react. We're going to try to evacuate, get out, move, respond as quickly as we can. So this is great once you know and you're defending your space, you're preparing for the possibility of a fight. It's not necessarily great if it's a spontaneous incident that happens right here and now. That doesn't excuse people from independently fighting, right? We don't encourage anyone through our training processes to go after a shooter. We tell them that as a last resort, when this person has entered your space and you've got no other option in terms of evacuation or sheltering, you've got to do something. So that's what this piece is about, and it's highly controversial. But if you do nothing, it's inevitable you're going to be a victim.
So this is a video here, just talks a little bit of improvised.
As a last resort, if your life is at risk, whether you are alone or working together as a group, fight. Act with aggression. Improvise weapons. Disarm him. And commit to taking the shooter down, no matter what.
All right, now we're going to talk about not evaluating a situation and being fluid about it. And emergency responders, police, fire department, their personnel, emergency responders are doing this to not get locked into tunnel vision. And if you shelter in place or hide and see the opportunity to run based on information that you observe or you know, it may be better now to change your plan and go and evacuate and run if you have that chance. Or all of a sudden, you're confronted with a fight situation. So these things are dynamic and they change as the emergency changes as well. You may be getting information from the police, whether that's through your phone or your outside public address system, etc. So these things you might want to have to change your decisions, or you might want to relocate where you're hiding at. You've got a better location to hide, a better secure thing, and you can go to that safely. You make those decisions. So, based on what you're observing, how you orient yourself to the situation, what are you seeing and what is your perceived threats there? Make a decision and go with it. Is that a little hard in a group situation? When you got 5 or 7 and 10 people trying to make a decision for the group, again, people have to step up and show leadership to make those decisions. Carry out the plan to the best of your abilities. And if the situation changes, always be willing to change and circle back around. So things to be considered, fire alarm. Bill talked about the fire alarm. Fire alarms in an active shooter situation can be used to draw you out of your hiding place. So you want to be cautious about that. Do you do that or do you not? That's a decision you have to make. If you don't smell smoke, you may want to be very cautious about that they're trying to draw you out. Stay in your secured area until you're told that it's been cleared, maybe by police coming through and evacuating you, or if your text messaging system, you may be getting messages. Again, can you rely on the text messaging system? I know the Lutheran Seminary has a text messaging system, and I'm on that, but are they really going to be able to activate the active shooter with the active shooter scenario 12 minutes and it's done? Are they really going to be able to get a message out within that 12 minutes to even tell you it's happening? Maybe, maybe not. It takes time to assess that and to be able to do that time of day. Maybe during the business day it'll be quicker, but at night it slows that process down. Outside the building, Bill talked about Las Vegas, and we saw how an outside venue, you can become trapped within that pretty quickly. So you need to know your exits, your secondary exits, even outside. Whether you go to the high school football game, where is the majority of people going to exit at a high school football game? Where they came in to pay, right? That one gate. So you've got 5,000 people at a football game, and somebody starts shooting, where's everybody going to run to? Going to run right back out. So you could be, you're in a trampled situation, a panic situation. So you want to look for those secondary areas or a place to hide and secure yourself. Football stadiums and high schools are typically what? Gates, right? There's fence the whole way around. They typically have some secondary exits there with some type of security, school security or something there. So that might be something you want to identify. Lock, secure, barricade, tie off your doors, turn off any lights. We want to keep the person, if they're outside, we want to keep them outside. Bill talked about recognizing gunfire. I mean, being able to identify that. And is that hard in Gettysburg and in the outside area of Gettysburg? Gunfire is probably not in Adams County. I hear it all the time. All right, there's people out shooting all the time. So it may not necessarily be an active shooter, but you just need to be aware of that situation downtown.
Around July of every year, right? Guns, cannons, you name it.
Yes, so Gettysburg has quite the uniqueness there. So, yeah, when you're in the outside space, look for those places to secure yourself and hide. It's probably difficult based on what kind of outside concert or venue you're at. It's probably very limited versus inside. All right, we've got a video coming up here just to summarize, evacuate, shelter in place, and take out, run, hide, fight. So we're going to watch this, show this video. It's based on a college campus, but it really talks about the run, hide, fight concept.
We'll get it.
Well, any questions while we're waiting for the video?
I think it's also helpful for us to remember the reason these guys are here today is because they do this in an institutional setting, and you're in an institutional setting, and you're going to be called upon to kind of lead these processes of figuring out what are the needs in your own place and how do you do those things. And so they've given you some really good tools today in an institutional thought process. They are not going to be able to answer every question and specific need that you have in your own location because, as they said today, each location is highly specialized. And so, again, back to the local law enforcement, please. There was a hand over here.
I have to ask, the very first thing.
Microphone, please.
So there were numerous slides that talked about communicating with 911, getting text messages, etc. And yet, when we first walked in here, it said turn off your cell phones, which of course I did. So when do you follow the instructions? When do you turn on and off your cell phone when you're coming into a venue?
Mine's on and on vibrate. I didn't see that sign, not my sign. I even tell faculty members not to do that with students anymore because that's how we communicate with our students, is through text messaging. So before Virginia Tech, a faculty member would say, put your cell phones away, shut them off, I don't want to hear them, I don't want to see them. Now they're leaning towards, hey, that's our means of notification. Sometimes a faculty member doesn't have that phone. They rely very heavily on the students to be able to alert them.
It's right out there.
Yeah.
Well, yes, because we had a large concert here last evening, and so turn off doesn't necessarily mean power down. Turn off in most spaces anymore means put it on silent so that it's still on your person and it's still vibrating. Okay, well, guess what? When you see a sign now that says, so that's a helpful thing to learn. So that turn off means make sure that your sounds are off so that you can still be contacted, but that it's not disturbing the venue of the space that you're in. So your phone doesn't ring during your pastor's sermon. Yeah.
Yeah.
You hope that it will never happen. But in the event that an active shooter is on campus, you must be prepared for the different scenarios that may present themselves.
Okay, you have to go to the building, which is right across the bridge. Okay. So if you just want to walk out.
If it sounds like gunfire, assume that it is and react. Barricade the door and lock it if possible. Turn off the lights and call the police if you are able. Gather objects to use as weapons and hide from the view of the gunman. Keep quiet and calm. When evacuating, run away from the sound of the gunfire. Distance yourself from the building where the shooting is taking place, and notify the police as soon as possible.
Textbooks out, we're going to be talking about how your brain functions, how we can start processing. How your brain functions. Get the lights. Get the lights. Everybody move over.
As a last resort, you must be prepared to fight back.
Distract the shooter, right? Grab stuff.
When the gunman enters, use a distraction. Attempt to control the barrel of the gun by pointing it towards the ground. When the gunman is disarmed, move the weapon as far away as possible and stand on it.
Clear left.
Down there. Where's he at? With it. Down there.
When the police arrive, have your hands over your head unless you are containing the gunman.
Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Shooter here. The gun is on the floor. Stay on the gun.
Listen to instructions and allow the officers to take control of the situation.
Stop resisting. Hands up.
The other arm back.
Hands up.
Clear. Got it down.
So, if you find yourself in an active shooter situation, remember, evacuate if possible. Take shelter in place if necessary. Or fight back as a last resort.
Really good video, especially for college students. It's pretty straightforward, as you can see. In these videos, or even the federal videos, they always tell you to be quiet and calm. Not sure how that works in the event of an incident like that, but certainly wise advice in terms of trying to educate. So just some resources. There is a FEMA EMA guide for developing high-quality emergency operations plans for houses of worship that's downloadable online on FEMA's website. And there's also, through the Justice Technology Information Center, Safeguarding Houses of Worship. So that information can certainly get to you if you want to go ahead and download those. There's pamphlets. The FEMA website, this is the guide specifically for houses of worship. A lot of really good information. Not unlike what we covered, but goes into detail in terms of planning, processes, outreach to local law enforcement, what an emergency operations plan might look like or should look like. And then on your way out, there's some handouts that talk about the concepts of, it says evacuate, hide out, take action. It's the run, hide, fight method that I think pretty much summarizes most of what we talked about today. And then a list of resources of where we stole this information. No, I'm just kidding. Resources that we relied upon to prepare the presentation. And questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Some congregations are electing to lock their doors after the worshipers arrive. You have someone to watch the doors, but they come into the building, services started, lock the doors, you have your crash hardware so you can get out. But
That's going to be my question. Right?
And just curious what you think of that particular process.
Yeah, I think as long as people inside can safely evacuate if they need to, without hesitation, like you're not having to unlock the door with a key, I don't see any problem with that. I think that's from a planning perspective, if that's what you want to put into your planning process, that's one thing to certainly implement.
I'm just wondering if any of the churches represented here today have implemented a plan and have an active plan in place.
Show of hands, any congregations have an active plan in place? One.
Just another detail question that I'm sure doesn't apply to just us. We have a building with a whole lot of glass in the doors that was put there intentionally for, the former threat that everybody was terrified of, which was keeping children safe. So now what do we do with the fact that we've got all these doors that can easily be broken through with or without a gun?
Yeah, I mean, so we obviously have the same situation, and we talk about through crime prevention through environmental design as we change and move forward, because we can't do it all at once because we don't have the ability to be able to do that. So what do we think in terms of that? If something's happening around glass doors, we're now thinking about barricade. So we're thinking about having things near those doors, things, chairs, whatever, wherever we normally would otherwise store some of this stuff, near those doors so that they can easily be moved in front of those doors. Again, if they can lock, if they can lock, even having someone smash through them to unlock it is highly unlikely if there's other rich targets, right? You're trying to reduce the likelihood of that person easily gaining access. But I would say try to think about how do you barricade those spaces.
Our church has an additional problem in that we have a lot of outside groups coming in, and particularly at night. So we have a security issue there because we're not actually worshiping at that point during the Sunday morning hours, but we have people from the community. And it's a little less easy to screen those people than it would be for your own worshipers.
Right.
How do we handle that?
So first I'm going to flip the narrative on that, and that's a great thing that's happening, is that your building is being used by the community, and so that's a very exciting thing. And so maybe that's part of the process with the security protocols that you put in place, that someone from the congregation meets with those groups to teach them about the security protocols that you have in place. Because you're right, you can't screen everyone, but what you can do is help have preventative measures in place.
Yeah, and so a good example for us is every summer we have conference services who bring on oftentimes juvenile camps. So we meet with those folks who are in charge of those camps about our emergency operations processes so that they can respond and communicate to the students. So that's one way to do that, and I think an important way to do that. The other thing too is part of our planning process is we're all going to assume a certain amount of risk, right? We just have to. Otherwise, we're going to take the church and we're going to put armor around it, and we're never going to be able to leave. So in your planning process, you've got to think about that. I think having outside groups use your space is exactly what you want, your church to be, an extension of the community and for the community to actually be able to use the space. But I think there's a way to at least reach to the adults, so to speak, or the leaders or the group folks who identify themselves, who reach out to the church and say, hey, can I use your space? Yep, you can. But before we have that conversation, let's talk about emergency operations preparation and planning. And that could be a one-page thing. Here you go. Think about this stuff as you're using our space.
That's an interesting point. Do we end up as the property owner having any liability for the safety of the groups that we let use our property?
Yes. So that's something to think about. I mean, when we, again, we're having, I'm thinking about a large operation. I don't know how this translates to an individual congregation or church, but when a conference camp comes on our campus, they have to be properly insured. They have to be, so you are assuming a certain amount of risk when you're opening the doors to folks who are unaffiliated, normally unaffiliated with your institution.
There hasn't been much in the courts on these issues.
No.
Those are good questions for your insurance companies.
Yeah.
Yeah. The congregation's insurance company. Oh. Ignorance is not always bliss.
There's a gentleman, and I can get it. There's a gentleman that puts out a newsletter. It's called sheepdogchurchsecurity.net. Chris Maloney. And he puts out a newsletter about at least once a month. Goes over any active or any recent church shootings, and has a lot of good information in there if you're interested.
That's great. The other unfortunate thing is we learn from every sad event, or at least we should, and think about that. And if you have an opportunity to reach out to some of these churches, or we reach out to other colleges and say, tell us about your experience, understanding and recognizing it was an unfortunate experience. We want to be able to provide support, resources, and assistance if we can, but we also want to learn from it. So a newsletter or some way of connecting to the community is a great way to share information.
Gentlemen, thank you so very much for your time and your education on this topic. If you would be interested in receiving this video, please be sure to either write your email address very legibly. I'm looking at you. Please write it very legibly on the tablet on your way out, or you can email me directly, and my email address is chuth@uls.edu. and I will send you this video link so that you have it available. The video link will only be available until January 30th, because as I said in the beginning of this is not to be the penultimate training video. This is just for information purposes so that you can start the conversations back in your places and you know the ways to start planning for safety and security in your own places. Thank you so much for your time and being here today. I look forward to seeing you at other helpful, wonderful, theologically filled events here at ULS. Blessings to you all and a blessed Advent. Let us pray. We are called to live in this world. We are called to be amongst all people. We are not called to stay hidden away on the mountaintop. It's a fear-filled place at times. And so we give thanks, dear God, for your presence in all of these things. May it give us courage to go out and do your will and share your love through the life, death, and resurrection of your dear Son, Jesus. All of these things we give thanks in your name. And all God's people said, amen.